The problem with Butler is not just that people still have questions. The problem is that every official explanation now seems to create a second problem. That is where this story begins. Not with the most dramatic theory, not with the most viral clip, not even with Thomas Crooks himself. It begins with a pattern. Every road the institutions take seems to lead not toward closure, but toward another layer of distrust that is the framework for the whole case, an explanation trap. Because the real story is not that someone has proved a grand hidden plot they have not. The real story is that the official account has never become strong enough to dominate the event. And once that happens, each attempt to defend the ordinary story starts weakening something else. Take the most basic road first, a lone attacker, a horrifying but isolated assassination attempt, a security breakdown, tragedy, confusion, human failure. Fine, then the public asks the simplest possible question. If that is the explanation, why does it still feel so thin? Why is the motive story still so weak? Why does Crooks remain so underbuilt in public understanding? Why does the digital trail still feel more disputed than clarified? Why does the whole thing still feel less explained than it should a year and a half later? That is the first trap. The ordinary story now carries too much unresolved weight. Now take the second road. Suppose the deeper issue is simply institutional incompetence, Secret Service failure, communication breakdowns, blind spots, a devastating but human protective collapse. Fine again, then the public expects something familiar in return. It expects large-scale accountability, firings, demotions, visible internal reckoning, something that tells the country the state understands the scale of its own disgrace. But the image left behind, as reflected in your source material, does not feel like that. It feels too soft, too survivable, too bureaucratically calm for a failure of this magnitude that matters because incompetence is politically survivable only when accountability looks larger than the incompetence. If the incompetence is enormous and the visible consequences feel limited, then the incompetence story itself stops reassuring people. That is the second trap. Then take the FBI road. The public was left with the impression of Thomas Crooks as a thin figure in digital terms, almost ghost-like in the way he was initially described. Then later reporting claims a much richer cluster of accounts, trails, and online material. Maybe not every claimed connection will survive the highest evidentiary test. Fine, that is not the main issue. The main issue is the asymmetry. If the federal government knew far more than it said, then withholding becomes the scandal. If it did not know far more than it said, then investigative weakness becomes the scandal. Either way, trust declines. That is the third trap. Now take the foreign link road. This is where commentary often becomes unserious. So precision matters. The strongest argument is not a foreign hand has been proved. The strongest argument is that the public does not feel it saw a full, transparent effort to exhaust those lines in public view. If there was enough reason to ask whether any known Iran-linked threat environment touched this event, even indirectly, why does it feel as though the visible institutional appetite to run those questions down was so weak? That does not prove a foreign connection, but it creates another cost. Because if there was no connection, the public wants to know why that was not strongly and visibly ruled out. If the answer is secrecy, then secrecy itself becomes another engine of suspicion. That is the fourth trap. Then comes Trump. This may be the most destabilizing part of the whole story because it does not fit the person. Trump lives by repetition. He revisits old injuries compulsively. He can turn a grievance into an endless stream of political energy. If anyone should have made Butler the center of a permanent emotional narrative, it is him. Instead, he largely sealed it off. He said he would tell the story once and never again. And then, incredibly, that is almost what happened. He does not revisit Butler with the hunger he brings to nearly everything else. He does not build a daily demand for answers around it. He does not carry it the way he carries 2020 media slights, legal grievances, or old insults. That is weird, not dispositive, not proof, but weird enough that the public cannot ignore it because behavior matters in public interpretation. If the principal victim behaves in a way that feels psychologically off script, that alone increases the pressure on every institutional explanation surrounding him. That is the fifth trap. Then comes the footage. This is the zone where weak analysis usually mutates into hysteria. So discipline matters. No unusual visual sequences after the shooting do not prove staging. No, calm movement or guided photographers do not by themselves settle anything. There are perfectly ordinary reasons professionals might move differently under pressure than ordinary viewers imagine, but politically, that is not the whole issue. The issue is that in a low trust environment, even ambiguous visuals become expensive. They begin to feel choreographed even when they may not have been. They become symbols of management instead of fragments of chaos. And once a case has become a trust crisis, every symbol starts doing work no institution can easily reverse. That is the sixth trap. Every explanation road creates a new legitimacy cost. If it was a lone attacker, the motive story still feels too weak. If it was just a security failure, the accountability feels too small. If investigators knew more, the withholding matters. If they knew less, the incompetence matters. If the strange visuals are innocent, the government still failed to explain them strongly enough to neutralize their effect. If Trump is simply traumatized, his behavior still collides hard with everything the country already knows about how he treats grievance and injury. That is why Butler has become more than an unresolved event. It has become a logic crisis. No single official explanation feels strong enough to absorb all the public contradictions around it. And once that happens, the burden shifts. Alternative theories no longer have to overpower a dominant official narrative. The official narrative has to keep defending itself against an ever-growing field of public doubt. That is where the institutions are now losing. Not because they have been conclusively disproven, but because they have failed to make the ordinary story feel more credible than the alternatives. That is a catastrophic form of weakness in a case like this. Because public trust does not only depend on whether the state is right, it depends on whether the state looks serious enough, transparent enough, and accountable enough to deserve the benefit of the doubt. Butler has not met that standard, and every month that passes without stronger closure makes the problem worse. Silence starts to look like concealment, caution starts to look like management, no comment starts to sound like narrative maintenance instead of investigative discipline. The event does not settle, it curdles. That is why the source material is strongest when it avoids claiming too much. The strongest case here is not, we know the final answer. The strongest case is, the official answer has become too fragile to carry the event. That is devastating enough on its own, because what it means is that the state did not merely leave some questions open. It left itself open. It left itself vulnerable to the charge that it wanted closure faster than it wanted clarity. And once the public absorbs that lesson, the damage expands beyond Butler. It becomes a lesson about institutions, generally about whether they are still capable of telling the truth in a way that can survive political pressure, public distrust, and partisan information warfare. That is why Butler will keep reopening, because it is no longer only a shooting story. It is now a permanent exhibit in the politics of broken belief. A shooter on a roof, a former president hit a bystander dead, a digital trail still disputed. A principal victim acting strangely quiet, a security breakdown too large for the accountability that followed it, and a government that still has not managed to make the ordinary story feel ordinary enough to trust. That is the explanation trap. And once a state falls into it, every attempt to escape risks deepening the hole. That is the real scandal of Butler. Not that all doubt is wise, not that every theory is serious, but that the institutions responsible for the truth behaved in ways that made disbelief feel rational. I think once disbelief becomes rational, the event stops being historical, it becomes active, a living fracture between the public and official reality. That is why Butler stays open. Because the state did not prove a conspiracy, it proved something politically worse, that it could not even convincingly defend the simple story. And in modern politics, once the simple story fails, everything else gets in.